Chris Coleman stood outside his house, a picture of serenity. It was a quiet suburban neighborhood in Columbia, Illinois, where the houses were neat, lawns well kept, and the air always seemed to hum with tranquility. His house, tucked neatly at the end of the street, was a beacon of suburban perfection. Inside, his wife, Sherry, was preparing dinner in the kitchen, while their two sons, Gavin and Garrett, played in the living room. The kind of life people envied, or so it seemed. To anyone on the outside, the Coleman family was the embodiment of success and happiness. Chris worked as the head of security for Joyce Meyer Ministries, one of the largest Christian organizations in the country. He was well respected, held in high regard by his colleagues, and admired by his peers. Sherry, a devoted wife and mother, kept their home in perfect order, and their children, two young, bright-eyed boys, were the apple of their parents' eye. But beneath the surface of this seemingly perfect life, something was slowly cracking. A distance had grown between Chris and Sherry, a distance that wasn't visible to the casual observer, but was felt deeply by Sherry. She had noticed it for months now. Chris was preoccupied, distant, and oddly secretive. He spent more time away from home, more time on his phone, and when he was home, he was often cold and distracted. Sherry couldn't put her finger on it, but the unease she felt had only been growing stronger. The tipping point came a week ago when Chris first received the anonymous threats. At first, he had dismissed them as a prank, a series of threatening emails from a faceless sender, warning him to leave Joyce Meyer Ministries or face dire consequences. Sherry had been concerned, but Chris had reassured her that it was nothing to worry about. He even joked about it, saying, "If it were real, they would have shown up at the door by now." But Sherry couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She knew something was off, but she didn't know what. The tension that had been building between them was becoming more palpable with each passing day. Chris's phone was always within arm's reach, never left unattended. He was constantly checking his messages, his tone increasingly short when Sherry tried to engage him in conversation. "I'm just busy, Sherry. Can we talk later?" he would say, brushing her off. Sherry noticed the changes in him, but what troubled her more than anything was how he seemed to be pulling away from the family. It wasn't just the emotional distance. He was physically absent as well. He was gone more often, whether it was for late-night meetings or business trips that didn't seem to make sense. One evening after Chris left for the gym, Sherry sat at the kitchen table, nervously tracing the rim of her coffee cup. She hadn't told anyone about her suspicions, not even her best friend, but she was starting to feel like something was about to snap. She looked over at the framed picture of their family on the wall, a snapshot from a vacation 2 years ago. Everyone was smiling, the four of them on a beach, arms around each other. It felt like a lifetime ago. Chris returned from his gym session later that night, his face shadowed with the same cold expression that had become all too familiar. He greeted Sherry with a quick kiss on the cheek, barely looking at her. Gavin and Garrett were already in bed, fast asleep. "Everything okay?" Sherry asked softly, her voice trembling just a little. Chris glanced at her, his eyes cold. "Yeah, everything's fine, just tired," he muttered, before retreating to their bedroom. Sherry sat there for a moment, the silence in the house overwhelming her. Something was wrong. She could feel it in her bones. She had no proof, no concrete reason to suspect anything. But the way Chris was acting, the distance, the secrecy, the fear in his eyes when he thought no one was watching, made her believe that something dark was brewing underneath. As the clock ticked into the early hours of the morning, Sherry couldn't shake the feeling that the life they had built together, the perfect life everyone saw, was about to come crashing down. Little did she know, the storm was already on the horizon. The days following Chris's unsettling behavior only added more weight to the uneasy silence hanging over the Coleman household. Despite his assurances that everything was fine, Sherry couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong. The perfect facade that Chris had always projected began to crack. What had seemed like an unshakable marriage was starting to show signs of strain. Sherry stood in the kitchen one afternoon, carefully slicing vegetables for dinner, her thoughts racing. She glanced at the clock, noting that Chris should have been home by now. The gym was only a 15-minute drive away, yet he was often gone longer than expected. It wasn't unusual for him to get caught up in work or socialize with colleagues, but today, the feeling of unease gnawed at her. The sound of the front door opening interrupted her thoughts. Chris stepped in, his face tight, his expression unreadable. He didn't offer the usual greeting, no, "How was your day?" or "Hey, honey." His eyes briefly met hers but quickly darted away as if he were avoiding some invisible confrontation. "Hey, Chris," Sherry said, forcing a smile. "Dinner will be ready in about 10 minutes." Chris nodded, his gaze flicking to the clock. "I need to take care of something in the garage. I'll be in soon." Sherry watched him walk toward the garage, the door closing behind him. She sighed, placing the knife down and wiping her hands on a towel. Something was different about him, something Sherry couldn't pinpoint but felt deep in her gut. It wasn't just the distance between them. There was a coldness now, a sharp edge to his behavior. Later that evening, after dinner, Sherry noticed Chris again retreating into his world. He buried himself in his phone, barely making eye contact. His responses to her questions were clipped, his focus always on the screen. The man she once knew, the man who would laugh with her over dinner and share stories of his day, seemed to be slipping away. When Chris finally looked up from his phone, Sherry took a deep breath. It was time to ask the question that had been lingering in her mind for days. "Chris," she began softly, her voice tinged with uncertainty, "is everything all right between us? You've been so distant lately." Chris's eyes flashed briefly with something, guilt, irritation, or perhaps both. But the moment passed quickly. He put his phone down and rubbed his face with his hands, a tired sigh escaping him. "I'm just stressed, Sherry," he replied, his tone flat. "You know how work has been. Just give me some space, all right?" Sherry's heart sank as she nodded, unsure of what to say. She had never known Chris to shut her out like this. She respected his need for space, but something about his cold demeanor made her uneasy. She couldn't help but feel that this was more than just stress. There was something deeper, something he wasn't telling her. Later that night, as Sherry prepared for bed, she couldn't shake the nagging suspicion that had been growing in the pit of her stomach. Chris had always been a man of routine, and his recent erratic behavior was out of character. But it wasn't just his actions. There was something about his secrecy, the way he would always guard his phone or quickly dismiss any conversation that made him uncomfortable. As she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, her mind wandered back to the emails, the anonymous threats that had started just a few weeks ago. Chris had brushed them off, but Sherry couldn't forget how shaken he had seemed when they first arrived. The threats didn't feel like something to ignore. Sherry couldn't understand why Chris seemed so calm about it. Why wasn't he more concerned for their family's safety? And then, as if on cue, Chris's phone buzzed. Sherry's eyes darted to it. His phone was always nearby, and this time he didn't pick it up immediately. He stared at the screen for a moment, then quickly locked it and set it down on the nightstand. Sherry's heart pounded in her chest as she lay there, pretending to be asleep. There was a sense of betrayal in the air. What was Chris hiding? Was he keeping secrets from her? Or worse, was there something darker at play? The next morning, Sherry decided to go through Chris's things. It was a decision she would later regret, but in that moment, her curiosity and fear overwhelmed her. She searched his desk, his car, and even his briefcase. Everything seemed normal, but then she found something, an envelope tucked away in the back of his briefcase. The handwriting on the front was familiar, but it sent a chill down her spine. It was a letter, one of the threatening emails he had been receiving, printed out and saved. Sherry's hands trembled as she unfolded the letter, reading the ominous words. "Your family will pay the price for your betrayal," it read. The weight of the words hit her hard, like a punch to the gut. She felt a wave of panic rise in her chest, and yet she couldn't look away. This was real. Whatever Chris was involved in, whatever dark secret he was hiding, it was much worse than she had imagined. The question burned in her mind. Was this all just a terrible coincidence? Or was there something more sinister behind the threats? Sherry's mind raced as she stood in the kitchen. The letter from Chris's briefcase clenched tightly in her hands. The words from the threatening email echoed in her head. "Your family will pay the price for your betrayal." Her pulse quickened as she tried to make sense of it all. She had always trusted Chris. He was her husband, the father of her children. But now everything felt like a lie. She looked around the house, trying to hold herself together. The sounds of Gavin and Garrett laughing as they played in the living room seemed so distant now. How could everything seem so normal while there was a storm brewing just beneath the surface? She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. Something had to be done. That evening after dinner, Sherry decided she couldn't keep this secret anymore. She had to confront Chris. As the boys went to bed, she found herself pacing in the kitchen, her heart racing. Chris was late again. This time he had promised to be home by 7:30, but it was already after 8 o'clock. She knew he was still at the office, pretending to work late, but the more she thought about it, the more the feeling of dread settled in her chest. The front door creaked open. Chris stepped in, looking as tired and distant as ever. His face, usually full of confidence, now appeared drawn and troubled. He didn't even look at her as he removed his shoes and walked past her into the living room. "You're late again," Sherry said, her voice steady but laced with concern. "What's going on with you, Chris?" He paused for a moment, then turned around to face her. His eyes met hers, but there was something cold in them, something that wasn't there before. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. Finally, he sighed and ran a hand through his hair. "I'm just stressed, Sherry. I told you this already," he said, his voice flat. But his words didn't reassure her. There was something more. "Stressed?" she repeated, her tone tight. "Chris, this isn't just stress. Something's wrong, I can feel it. We've been through a lot together, but you're acting like a stranger." Chris's face hardened, his jaw clenching. "You're overreacting," he said, though his voice held a hint of defensiveness. "I'm trying to work things out, but you need to give me space. Stop pushing me." Sherry's eyes filled with a mixture of hurt and confusion. She had never seen him like this. The man who had always been there for her, who had held her when she cried, who had promised to protect their family, was slipping away from her. He was no longer the person she had married. "Chris, what about the threats?" Sherry's voice trembled. "What about those emails you've been getting? You don't seem concerned. Why aren't you doing anything to protect us?" Chris stiffened, his eyes narrowing. "I've already told you it's nothing to worry about, just some idiot trying to scare me." "Let it go, Sherry." But Sherry couldn't let it go. The threat felt real, and so did the fear that Chris wasn't telling her the truth. She stood there staring at him, waiting for something, anything, to break the wall he had put up between them. "Why won't you let me in, Chris?" she asked, her voice quiet but firm. "Why won't you tell me what's really going on?" For a long moment there was nothing but silence. Chris's gaze dropped to the floor, and when he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "You wouldn't understand, Sherry." Sherry's stomach twisted. She could feel the distance between them growing with each passing second. She didn't understand, and that terrified her. The door to the living room creaked open, and Gavin's voice called out, "Mom! Dad! Can we have a snack?" Sherry looked at Chris one last time before turning to the boys. "Sure, honey," she said, forcing a smile. She walked into the living room, her mind reeling. There was no way she could ignore what was happening any longer. The danger wasn't just coming from outside the house. It was already here, inside their home. As the boys settled down with their snacks, Sherry's thoughts spiraled. She had always believed that the foundation of their family was unshakable. But now, she wasn't sure of anything. The emails, the secrecy, the coldness between them, everything pointed to something more sinister. She had to find out the truth. She had to protect her family, no matter the cost. Sherry sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped tightly around a steaming cup of coffee. The house was still, eerily still. The usual noise from Gavin and Garrett, the sounds of children playing seemed distant, swallowed up by the tension that now filled every corner of the home. Chris was in the garage again, working on something, though she couldn't remember the last time he'd actually fixed anything. She hadn't heard him come back inside after his usual late-night visit to the garage. Her thoughts were a whirlwind of confusion and dread. She knew something was wrong. Every time she tried to confront Chris, he dismissed her fears. "You're imagining things," he'd say. But she couldn't ignore the growing sense of unease deep in her gut. There were secrets in this house, secrets Chris wasn't sharing. And as the days went by, they seemed darker, more dangerous. It had been nearly a week since she discovered the threatening letter hidden in Chris's briefcase. Each day, the unease had grown. Sherry couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was going on, it wasn't going to end well. She tried to focus on the children, on keeping things normal, keeping the facade of the perfect family intact. But it was becoming impossible. Gavin had started asking questions. Why is Dad always so tired? Why doesn't he play with us anymore? His innocent voice cut through her like a knife. Sherry could only offer empty reassurances. He's just busy, sweetheart. He's working hard for us. But she knew deep down that wasn't the truth. Then, one evening, it happened. Chris walked in late, his face tense and his eyes dark. Sherry was in the kitchen putting away the dinner dishes. She didn't even look up at first, but when she heard the sound of his boots against the hardwood floor, something in her snapped. He was always so distant now, always coming and going at strange hours. But tonight, something about his presence made her stomach tighten. She turned to face him, trying to steady her voice. "Chris, we need to talk." He didn't answer at first. He simply hung up his jacket and walked past her without even a glance. But she could feel the tension in the air. Something was wrong, and she wasn't going to let it slide this time. "I'm serious," she said, her voice firm but soft. "We need to talk." Chris stopped in his tracks and turned to face her. His face was drawn, his eyes clouded with something. Anger? Guilt? She couldn't tell anymore. "What do you want me to say, Sherry?" His voice was low, tinged with frustration. "I've told you, I'm fine. Everything's fine." But Sherry could see the cracks in his facade, the tiny movements that betrayed the calmness he was trying to project. His hands were clenched into fists at his sides, and he wouldn't meet her gaze. "You've been saying that for weeks," she said, her voice trembling slightly, though she was trying to stay composed. "But it's not fine. Something's happening, and I don't know what it is, but it's scaring me." Chris's face hardened, his jaw tightening. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself, but it was clear that the anger wasn't far below the surface. "Sherry, stop," he said sharply. "I'm doing this for us. You think this is easy for me? I'm trying to protect this family, but you keep pushing me, and I'm not sure how much more I can take." Sherry stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest. His words hit harder than she expected. Protect the family? She couldn't help but wonder if that was the truth, or if it was just another lie. Before she could respond, Chris turned and walked toward the garage again, his footsteps heavy and deliberate. She watched him go, the door to the garage slamming shut behind him. Silence followed, the kind of silence that filled a room when something important had just been said, but nothing had been resolved. Sherry stood there for a moment, taking in everything. She could hear Gavin and Garrett upstairs playing quietly in their room. Their laughter, so innocent and full of life, made the weight of the situation feel even heavier. How could she protect them from whatever was lurking just around the corner if she couldn't even protect herself? Her mind wandered back to the emails, the threats that had been sent to Chris. She thought about the letter she had found and the way Chris had tried to dismiss it. What was going on? And more importantly, why did he seem so calm, as if the danger was something he was willing to ignore? Sherry couldn't shake the feeling that things were spiraling out of control. The calm before the storm was always the most deceptive. The tension in the house was growing, and she could feel it tightening, like a noose around their necks. The next morning, as Sherry prepared breakfast for the kids, Chris remained distant. He was silent as he sat down at the table, his eyes fixed on his coffee cup, as if he were somewhere far away. Sherry couldn't help but wonder, how long could they all live like this? The constant tension, the growing fear, it was becoming too much to bear. But she had to keep up the illusion. For the kids, for the family, the perfect family. For now, the calm persisted. But Sherry knew, deep down, that it wouldn't last much longer. Sherry couldn't sleep. The weight of the past few days, the strange sense that something terrible was waiting just around the corner, gnawed at her every moment. She had spent hours thinking about everything. The threats, Chris's distant behavior, the lies she suspected he was hiding. But nothing seemed to add up. It was the middle of the night when she heard the faint sound of Chris slipping out of bed. She had already been lying awake for what felt like hours, and his movements made her heart race. Sherry held her breath, straining to hear if he was heading out again, into the garage or maybe even further away to meet someone. The man she married was slipping through her fingers, and she had no idea what he was doing in the dead of night. Quietly, she slipped out of bed, her bare feet making no sound on the cold wooden floors. She stood at the edge of their bedroom door and watched as Chris silently moved about, gathering something from his dresser. It was too dark to see clearly, but Sherry could just make out the outline of him stuffing something into a duffel bag. Her heart skipped a beat. What was he preparing for? Her first instinct was to confront him, to demand answers, but something held her back. The man she had trusted, the man she had loved, was becoming a stranger, and Sherry wasn't sure how far she could push without risking everything. Instead, she waited, watching him slip out of the room and into the garage. The sound of the door closing behind him filled the silence of the house, and Sherry's mind began to race. She knew she couldn't wait any longer. She had to find out what was going on. The preparations were happening right in front of her, and yet she had no idea what the endgame was. The threats, those chilling emails, had started to feel like a ticking time bomb. But Chris seemed unfazed, almost nonchalant about it all. And Sherry? She was terrified. When morning finally came, Chris was distant, his usual routine so out of place. He barely spoke to her as he prepared for work. The emptiness in his eyes was becoming harder to ignore. Sherry wanted to ask him about the bag, about the late-night trips to the garage, but she kept quiet, her mind racing with questions she wasn't ready to voice. The day dragged on, and by the time Chris came home, it was already late. Sherry stood in the kitchen, her hands trembling slightly as she wiped down the counters. He entered the house silently, as he had done so many times before, and went straight to the living room without a word. This time, Sherry couldn't keep quiet. The fear that had been building in her chest finally pushed her into action. "Chris," she called out, her voice steady but strained, "I need to talk to you." He didn't turn around right away, and when he did, his expression was unreadable. "What now, Sherry?" he asked, his tone sharp, as though he were irritated by her insistence. She could feel the lump in her throat, but she swallowed it down. "What are you doing, Chris? What are you hiding from me?" Chris let out a sigh, stepping closer but keeping his distance. His eyes flickered for a moment before settling on hers. "I'm just trying to keep us safe, Sherry," he said, his voice low and defensive. "I've got things under control. Just trust me, okay?" Sherry shook her head. "You're not telling me everything. You're doing something, and I can't just pretend everything's fine anymore. You've been preparing for something, haven't you?" Chris stepped forward, his face hardening. "I told you, it's nothing," he snapped, his voice rising slightly. "You're overreacting, as usual." Sherry stood her ground, her fists clenched at her sides. "I don't believe you," she said quietly, almost to herself. "I don't believe any of it." Chris's eyes darkened, and he turned away, walking toward the stairs. "You need to drop it, Sherry. You'll just make things worse." But Sherry wasn't backing down. She couldn't. Her heart raced as she thought about the children upstairs, about how she had to protect them from whatever was coming. She had no idea what Chris was involved in, but she knew that something was coming. She could feel it in her bones. That night, after the kids were in bed, Sherry sat alone in the living room, her mind spinning. She tried to calm herself, but the gnawing fear wouldn't let her rest. Chris's words, "I'm trying to keep us safe," echoed in her mind. But why was he so secretive? What was he preparing for? The bag in the garage, the trips at odd hours, the growing distance between them. It was all connected, and Sherry knew that if she didn't do something soon, it might be too late. Her decision was made. She would find out what Chris was really hiding, no matter what it took. The calm before chaos was always the most dangerous, and Sherry was about to find out just how true that was. The house was quiet that night, save for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of wind rustling through the trees. Sherry sat on the couch, her hands folded in her lap, but her mind was racing. The past few weeks had felt like a slow-moving train, inching toward a crash she couldn't stop. She had tried, in every way she knew how, to understand what was happening to her family, but now, as the clock ticked toward midnight, she had no more answers, only a gnawing sense that something terrible was about to unfold. She hadn't spoken to Chris in hours. After the argument earlier in the day, he had retreated into the garage again, as he often did. Sherry couldn't remember the last time they had a real conversation, one where he wasn't hiding something, one where she felt like he was truly present. The Chris she had known seemed to be slipping further away, replaced by something else. She had tried to confront him, to force him to open up, but he always shut her out, retreating into silence. And now, as she sat alone, she couldn't ignore the feeling that tonight would be different. The door to the garage creaked open. Sherry stiffened, her breath catching in her throat. Chris walked past her, as he always did, without a word. She had tried countless times to reach him, but he never let her in. "Chris," Sherry called softly, her voice tight with both fear and frustration. "We need to talk." But Chris didn't stop. He walked into the living room and Sherry followed, her footsteps quickening. She had to know what was happening. She couldn't just sit back and wait for the storm to hit. "Chris," she repeated, louder this time, her voice trembling. "Why are you doing this? Why won't you tell me what's going on?" Chris turned slowly, his expression unreadable, his jaw clenched. He didn't respond right away. Instead, he reached for his phone and unlocked it, his fingers moving quickly over the screen. Sherry's heart sank as she watched him, knowing he was shutting her out once again. "I told you, Sherry," he said finally, his voice cold. "It's nothing. It's just work. Stop making this harder than it has to be." "Work?" Sherry's voice broke. "That's not what this is about, Chris. You've been lying to me, to all of us. What are you preparing for? What's going on? You're scaring me." Chris's face hardened. For a moment, he looked as though he might say something, something that would explain everything. But instead, he turned away and walked back toward the garage. "Don't walk away from me," Sherry said, her voice desperate. "Please, Chris, I'm not going to stand by and watch this family fall apart." But Chris didn't answer. He didn't even look at her. The door to the garage closed behind him with a sharp thud, and Sherry stood there, breathless, a cold wave of fear washing over her. She could feel it in her bones. Something was about to happen. It was just after 3 a.m. when Sherry awoke to the sound of Chris moving through the house. She sat up in bed, her heart pounding in her chest. She glanced at the clock, confusion settling in as she tried to piece together what was happening. Chris was walking through the house again, but this time, there was a certain urgency in his steps. She heard him in the hallway, then in the garage, moving things around. Sherry's mind raced. She couldn't just lie there anymore. She couldn't keep pretending everything was fine when she knew it wasn't. She swung her legs over the side of the bed, her feet touching the cold hardwood floor. Her pulse quickened as she crept toward the door, listening carefully. She needed to know what was happening. Stepping quietly down the hallway, Sherry reached the kitchen and paused, trying to steady her breathing. The dim light from the garage filtered through the cracks in the door. She could hear Chris's voice, but it was muffled, as if he was speaking to someone. For a moment she hesitated. Should she open the door? Should she confront him now? She knew she had to, but a deep, gnawing fear held her in place. If she opened that door, there would be no turning back. With a shaky breath, Sherry reached for the handle, but just as her fingers brushed against the cool metal, the sound of a car engine starting broke through the silence. Sherry froze. The sound was distant, but it was unmistakable. Chris was leaving. Sherry's heart raced as she swung the door open, rushing out into the garage. She was too late. The car was already pulling out of the driveway, and Chris's figure disappeared into the night. Her mind spun. Where was he going? Who was he meeting? She stood there in the cold garage, her breath shallow, her hands shaking as the reality of the situation began to sink in. The man she had married was hiding something far darker than she could have imagined. Sherry felt the weight of the silence around her, the cold emptiness of the garage. She couldn't let him get away this time. She couldn't stand by and let him drag their family down a path she didn't understand. With a final, determined breath, Sherry grabbed her coat and keys. She wasn't going to wait for things to unravel on their own. She was going to find the truth. Sherry sat frozen in her car, watching as Chris's vehicle disappeared into the night. Her mind raced, her pulse pounding in her ears. She had to follow him. She had to know where he was going. But every nerve in her body screamed at her to stop. What if she was wrong? What if this was just another one of his work-related distractions? But something deep inside told her she couldn't afford to wait. Without thinking any further, Sherry started her car and followed at a distance, keeping her headlights dimmed, trying to remain unnoticed. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was playing with fire. The man she had trusted with her life, the father of her children, was slipping further away with each passing moment. Tonight, it seemed, the final truth was about to unfold. The roads were empty, the night quiet except for the sound of her engine. She kept her distance, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Her heart thudded in her chest as she watched Chris's car turn down a narrow street. It was a road she didn't recognize, far from their neighborhood, and Sherry felt her stomach twist with a mix of fear and anticipation. Chris's car slowed as it neared a small, secluded house at the edge of town. A part of Sherry wanted to turn around, to go home and pretend that nothing was wrong. But she couldn't. She had to know. She parked a few houses down, out of sight, and waited. The lights in Chris's car flickered as he parked, and then, without hesitation, he got out and headed toward the house. Sherry's breath caught in her throat. A sense of dread washed over her. She knew she shouldn't go any closer, but the curiosity, no, the need to know the truth, drove her forward. Stepping out of her car, she moved quietly toward the house, keeping to the shadows. She wasn't sure what she was expecting to find, but the silence of the night felt oppressive. As she neared the front yard, she saw Chris standing at the door, speaking to someone. Sherry's heart skipped a beat as the figure at the door turned. It was a woman. Tara. The realization hit Sherry like a punch to the stomach. She had seen the way Chris looked at Tara. She had seen the texts, the lingering phone calls, but seeing them together in person, standing in front of this unfamiliar house, confirmed everything Sherry had feared. This wasn't just a minor indiscretion. This was something much worse. Sherry felt a rush of emotions, anger, betrayal, fear flood through her, but she pushed them down, determined to stay calm. She had to understand the whole truth, no matter how painful it was. She didn't want to confront Chris. Not like this, not in front of Tara, but she couldn't leave without answers. Tara stepped closer to Chris, laughing softly at something he said. Sherry's stomach twisted. The laughter sounded wrong, like it didn't belong in this moment. Sherry was about to turn and leave when Chris leaned in, whispering something to Tara. His words were too soft for Sherry to catch, but his body language was unmistakable. He wasn't just apologizing, he was making plans. A cold chill ran through Sherry as she realized what was happening. Chris wasn't just having an affair, he was preparing to leave her, to abandon their family. The weight of that realization hit her hard, like a wave crashing over her, leaving her breathless. She stood there, hidden in the shadows, as Chris kissed Tara goodbye, before turning and walking back to his car. Sherry could barely breathe. She watched him drive away, her body frozen in place, her mind struggling to make sense of what had just happened. Everything she had built, everything she had trusted, was unraveling before her eyes. She had to get home. She had to protect her children. But even as she turned to leave, her mind couldn't escape the image of Chris and Tara standing together, their secrets now fully exposed. Sherry didn't know what was worse, the betrayal or the fact that she had let it happen. She walked back to her car, her legs heavy, each step feeling like it took her farther from the life she had known. But the truth was undeniable now. Her family was in danger, and Chris, the man she had loved for years, was the one threatening it. As she drove back home, the weight of the night settled over her. She had seen the truth, and it was far darker than she had imagined. The calm she had felt earlier was gone, replaced by a rising storm she couldn't control. There was no going back now. The events of the night would change everything. Sherry sat in the dimly lit living room, staring at the phone in her hand. The revelation from the night before had shaken her to her core. Chris's affair was now undeniable. The scene at Tara's house had confirmed everything, but it also raised more questions than it answered. What was Chris planning? Why had he been so secretive? And most importantly, why was he still trying to cover his tracks? Sherry knew she couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. She had to act. But what could she do? Chris had grown more and more distant, and Sherry feared that the next move would push their already fragile family into irreparable damage. The phone in her hand buzzed, interrupting her thoughts. It was a message from a familiar name, Detective Harris. The investigation was moving forward and the pressure was mounting on Chris. The police had started to piece together the events surrounding the threats, and Sherry's discovery of the threatening letter in Chris's briefcase was now a significant part of the investigation. She could feel the tightening grip of the truth, and as much as it terrified her, she knew it was the only way forward. Sherry read the message quickly. "Can you meet me? I need to talk to you about something important. It's about Chris." Her heart skipped a beat. The detective was calling in the pieces, and it was only a matter of time before the walls closed in on her husband. Without hesitation, Sherry grabbed her coat and left the house. She needed answers. She needed to know how deep this went, and how far Chris would go to protect his lies. The streets were quiet as she drove to the police station, the weight of her decision heavy on her chest. When she arrived, Detective Harris was waiting for her. His usual stern expression softened just slightly when he saw her. "Sherry, thanks for coming in," he said, leading her into a small interview room. "I know this hasn't been easy for you, but we're getting closer. Your information about the letters and the threats is crucial, and I want to make sure you understand what's happening next." Sherry nodded, trying to calm her racing thoughts. She sat across from him, waiting for him to speak again. "The threats have become a pattern," Detective Harris continued. "We've linked them back to Chris's work, and there's evidence he was trying to cover up his involvement. But there's something else, something more we need to explore." Sherry's stomach tightened as she waited for him to elaborate. "We've traced some phone calls, emails, and messages that Chris has been sending to a number of people, including Tara Lintz. He's been very careful to keep his communications hidden, but we've got enough to know there's a connection between his affair and the threats." Sherry's breath caught in her throat. She had feared it, suspected it even, but hearing it from the detective made it all feel so real. Chris's affair wasn't just a personal betrayal, it was part of something far darker. "Why didn't you tell me this sooner?" Sherry asked, her voice trembling. "We needed to be sure, Sherry," Detective Harris replied, his voice calm but firm. Chris has been playing both sides. The threats weren't just a tactic to intimidate him. They were also part of his plan to keep his family in the dark. But the evidence we're gathering shows he's been orchestrating everything behind the scenes. Sherry felt a lump form in her throat. Her mind reeled with the implications. Was this about the affair or was there something else? Had Chris been planning this all along? "Do you think he was involved in something worse?" Sherry asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She was terrified of the answer, but she needed to know the truth. "I can't say for sure yet," Harris said, "but the evidence we've found points to something deeper. I'm sorry, Sherry, but it's starting to look like Chris may have been involved in something more than just a failed marriage." Sherry's heart raced. The man she had shared her life with, the father of her children, was unraveling before her eyes, and she had been too blinded by her love for him to see the signs. Harris looked at her with sympathy, his tone softening. "Sherry, I know this is hard, but you need to understand what you're dealing with. We're close to bringing everything to light. The truth is coming." Sherry nodded, though her heart felt like it was breaking. She had never imagined that her husband, the man who had promised to protect her and their children, would be capable of something like this. As she left the police station, Sherry felt the weight of the world on her shoulders. The investigation was tightening around Chris, but the path ahead was still unclear. What would happen when everything came out? What would it mean for her family, for the children she was desperately trying to protect? She didn't know the answers, but one thing was certain. Her life, her family, and everything she thought she knew about her marriage had already changed forever. The tension in the house was palpable. Sherry sat at the kitchen table, her fingers nervously tapping on the surface. The events of the last few days, the revelations, the investigation, it all felt like a slow-moving storm that was finally about to break. She'd been trying to keep it together, for the sake of the children, but everything was slipping through her fingers. Chris's lies, the secrets he had kept from her, were now unraveling, and she wasn't sure how much longer she could stand to watch the man she had once loved destroy everything they had built. Her phone buzzed on the table, the screen lighting up with an incoming call. It was Detective Harris. Sherry answered quickly, her heart pounding. "Sherry, it's time," he said. His voice was serious with a hint of urgency. "We've gathered enough to make our move." Sherry's pulse quickened. "What does that mean? What's going to happen?" "We've confirmed everything we suspected. Chris's alibis are falling apart and the evidence is mounting. We'll be talking to him soon, but I need you to stay calm. I know this is hard, but we're doing this for you, for your family. It's time to face the truth." Sherry felt her chest tighten. The truth. She had been living in the dark for too long, hoping that things would go back to normal. But now, with the investigation closing in, she knew that normal was something that would never return. She hung up the phone and sat in silence for a moment, letting the weight of the situation sink in. The truth was coming, and nothing would be the same once it did. Later that evening, the house felt quieter than ever. Chris was home, but he was distant, as he had been for weeks. Sherry watched him, her eyes scanning every move he made, every flicker of emotion that passed across his face. He was trying to act normal, but she could see the cracks. The way he kept his phone out of sight, the way he avoided her gaze when she spoke. He was hiding something. It was becoming increasingly clear that Chris had been carefully crafting an alibi. The trips to the gym, the late nights at the office, the vague explanations about his whereabouts, none of it added up. The phone records, the emails, the timeline of the murders, it was all pointing to him. And yet, he was still pretending that everything was fine, still pretending that nothing had changed. Sherry took a deep breath and walked toward him. She could feel her hands shaking as she approached, but she couldn't stay silent any longer. She had to confront him. "Chris," she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "I know what you're doing. The lies, the secrets. You're not fooling me anymore." Chris looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Sherry, I don't know what you're talking about." "I'm not stupid, Chris," she said, her voice rising. "I know you've been seeing Tara. I know you've been planning to leave. You've been hiding things from me for months, and I'm done pretending I don't see it." Chris's face hardened, and for a moment there was silence. Sherry's heart raced as she waited for him to respond. Would he confess? Would he try to deny it all? Finally he spoke, his voice low and tight. "You don't understand, Sherry. You never did. This was never about you or the kids. It was about me, about my career, my life. You wouldn't understand the pressure I've been under. I didn't want to hurt you, but I couldn't keep living a lie." The words hit Sherry like a slap in the face. Her mind raced as she tried to process what he was saying. He wasn't sorry. He wasn't remorseful. He was justifying his actions. "You've been lying to me for months," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I trusted you, Chris. I loved you, and you betrayed me. You betrayed our family." Chris's jaw tightened and he turned away, refusing to meet her gaze. "I never meant for it to go this far," he said quietly. "But now it's too late." Sherry felt her world crumbling around her. The man she had married, the man who had promised to protect her and their children, was standing right in front of her, and yet he felt like a stranger. His alibis were falling apart and the truth was finally coming to light. For a moment, Sherry felt a flicker of hope that she might finally get the answers she had been seeking. But the reality was much darker. The investigation was tightening, and no matter how much she wanted to deny it, the truth was inescapable. Chris had crossed a line, and the consequences were inevitable. Her mind was a whirlwind of emotions: anger, hurt, disbelief. But beneath it all, there was a sense of clarity. This was the moment when everything would change. "How long, Chris?" Sherry asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "How long have you been planning this? How long have you been lying?" Chris didn't answer. He simply turned away, walking toward the stairs without a word. Sherry stood there watching him, feeling the walls closing in. She had known deep down that everything was falling apart, but now the truth was undeniable. The courtroom was quiet as Sherry sat in the front row, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. She had never imagined that it would come to this, that she would one day find herself here, watching her husband stand accused of murder. Chris was seated at the defense table, his face cold and expressionless, his eyes locked forward, not once glancing at her. His usual arrogance had dissolved into something harder, more dangerous. His alibi, the one he had so carefully crafted over the months, was now crumbling before his eyes. The trial had been ongoing for weeks, but this moment, today, felt like the breaking point. The truth, slowly but surely, was being laid bare for everyone to see. The jury listened intently as the prosecution laid out the timeline of events, each detail tightening the noose around Chris's neck. The threatening letters, the odd hours he spent away from home, the phone calls and messages to Tara Lintz. Every single thread was connected, and Chris's carefully constructed narrative was falling apart. Sherry felt her chest tighten as the prosecutor's voice echoed in the room. The words seemed to reverberate in her mind, drowning out everything else. The evidence was overwhelming. Chris's affair with Tara had been uncovered, and the lies he had told Sherry about his whereabouts had been exposed. But it wasn't just his infidelity. It was the lies about the threats, the way he had manipulated everyone, including her, into believing his innocence. She had been a pawn in his game, just like everyone else. For the first time in weeks, Sherry felt a deep sense of clarity. The weight of the uncertainty that had plagued her for months seemed to lift. It was as if a veil had been torn away and she could finally see the truth. It wasn't just the affair that had destroyed their marriage. It was the darkness Chris had been hiding all along, and now he was being forced to face it. As the prosecution continued to present their case, Sherry's mind flashed back to the night she had followed Chris to Tara's house. She remembered the way Chris had kissed Tara goodbye, the way he had looked at her with such ease, as if their betrayal had been nothing more than a casual affair. Sherry had stood in the shadows, her heart breaking with each passing moment. It was then that she had realized the full extent of his lies. The affair wasn't a small mistake. It was part of a larger, more dangerous game he had been playing. And now, here they were in this moment, with everything laid bare. Chris had been hiding more than just a relationship. He had been hiding the truth about his involvement in the murders of Sherry and their children. Sherry felt a wave of nausea wash over her as the courtroom became silent for a moment. The defense attorney had begun to speak, trying to spin a narrative of his own. He tried to paint Chris as the victim, as a man driven to desperation, someone who had been caught in a web of lies and deceit. But Sherry could see through it all. There was no excuse for what Chris had done, no justification for the pain he had caused her, no reason why he had left her and their children vulnerable to his web of deceit. The defense attorney's voice faltered as he turned toward Chris, hoping to offer him a glimmer of hope. Chris didn't flinch. He sat still, his face set in stone, offering nothing to his defense. He was a man trapped by his own lies, and now there was no escaping the consequences. As the prosecutor prepared to give his closing statement, Sherry felt a final surge of emotion. She had loved Chris once. She had trusted him with everything, her heart, her family, her future. But now, looking at him, she saw nothing but a man who had betrayed everything he once held dear. Sherry's eyes burned with unshed tears, but she refused to let them fall. She was done with the lies. She was done with the man who had torn their family apart. And now, as the jury prepared to deliberate, Sherry could only hope that the truth would finally prevail. The gavel came down, signaling the end of the day's proceedings. Sherry stood up, her legs shaky beneath her, but her resolve stronger than ever. She wasn't leaving this courtroom without justice. She wasn't going to let Chris get away with what he had done. Not to her, not to their children, and certainly not to the memory of their once happy family. She stepped out of the courtroom, her heart heavy, but a sense of finality settling over her. The truth had come out, and there was no going back. The courtroom was silent. The jury had returned with their verdict, and the air in the room seemed thick with anticipation. Sherry sat at the back, her heart pounding in her chest, her hands trembling in her lap. She had been through so much, months of suspicion, heartbreak, and now the long-awaited moment when Chris would finally face the consequences of his actions. Chris sat at the defense table, his eyes fixed on the floor. He had been like this throughout the trial, silent, unmoving, as though he had already accepted the fate that awaited him. But Sherry couldn't bring herself to look at him, not anymore. The man she had loved, the father of her children, had betrayed her in ways she couldn't have imagined. Now it was time for justice. The judge's voice broke through the silence. "Will the defendant please rise?" Chris slowly stood, his expression unreadable. The tension in the room was palpable as the jury foreman stood to deliver the verdict. Sherry's breath caught in her throat as she watched him, her hands gripping the sides of the chair. Her mind raced. Had they reached the right conclusion? Had justice been served? "We, the jury, find the defendant, Christopher Coleman, guilty of all charges," the foreman said. Sherry's heart skipped a beat. The words hit her like a wave, flooding her with a rush of emotions, relief, vindication, and a deep, aching sorrow that she could never have anticipated. Chris had been found guilty, not just of his infidelity, not just of his lies, but of murder. The murders of Sherry, Gavin, and Garrett. The weight of it was almost too much to bear. Chris didn't move, didn't react. His face remained stoic, as though the verdict had been inevitable. But Sherry saw it. She saw the flicker of fear, the brief tightening of his jaw. He knew what was coming. The judge nodded to the jury and turned his attention to Chris. "Mr. Coleman, you have been found guilty of the murder of your wife and children. You will be sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole." Sherry's breath shuddered in her chest as the words sank in. Life in prison. Chris would never walk free again. The man who had once promised to protect her, who had sworn to be her partner for life, was now facing the consequences of his monstrous actions. As the judge continued speaking, Sherry felt a strange sense of peace wash over her. For so long she had been consumed with confusion, with the desire for answers. But now, in this moment, the truth was clear. Chris had betrayed her, and now he would have to face the reality of what he had done. After the trial, Sherry stepped outside the courthouse, her mind still reeling from the events of the day. The weight of everything, the lies, the secrets, the pain, was finally starting to lift. But there was no joy in the victory. There was no satisfaction in seeing Chris brought to justice. She had lost too much. She had lost her husband, her children, and the life she had once thought was perfect. The future she had imagined for herself was shattered beyond repair. But even in the midst of her grief, Sherry knew she had to keep going. She had to keep moving forward, for herself, and for the memory of her children. The pain would never go away, but she could not let it define her. She had been through hell, but she was still standing. And in that, there was strength. As Sherry walked away from the courthouse, she looked up at the sky, her eyes filled with tears. She had found justice, but at what cost? The life she had known was gone, but she would carry the memory of her children with her forever. They would never be forgotten. They would always be a part of her. And that, Sherry realized, was the greatest victory of all. The days after Chris's sentencing blurred together in a haze of exhaustion and disbelief. The house, once filled with the noise of children playing and laughter, now felt like an empty shell. Sherry moved through the motions of life, each step heavy with the weight of everything she had lost. The verdict had been delivered, but the emotional toll of it all was far from over. She spent hours alone, walking through the house, touching the objects that once seemed so insignificant, The worn-out baseball glove on the hallway shelf, the family photos that had once been symbols of happiness, now reminders of a life she could never reclaim. Each memento felt like a ghost haunting her. Every corner of the home held a memory, both beautiful and painful, of the family she had once known. Sherry had always imagined that justice would bring her peace. The idea that Chris would be held accountable for his actions, that he would pay for what he had done, had been the only thing keeping her going through the trial. But now that it was over, there was no relief, no sense of closure. The pain of losing her children, of knowing that she would never hear their voices or feel their hugs again, still consumed her. It was a wound that no verdict could heal. She missed their laughter, the way they would run to her at the end of the day, their small arms wrapping around her in a way that made her feel invincible. Those moments now seemed like a distant dream. Sherry had spent months questioning herself, asking if she had missed the signs, wondering what she could have done differently to stop Chris from slipping away into the darkness. The truth, however, was that nothing could have prepared her for the depths of betrayal that had been hidden behind Chris's facade. She had loved him, she had trusted him, and in the end he had destroyed everything they had built together. But as time passed, something shifted within Sherry. The guilt and the self-blame that had plagued her began to fade, replaced by a quiet determination. She had survived, and despite the crushing weight of grief, she was still standing. She wasn't sure what the future held, but she knew she couldn't keep living in the past. Sherry's mind drifted back to the courtroom, to the moment when Chris had been sentenced to life in prison. She had watched him stand there, unflinching, his face a mask of indifference. There had been no apology, no remorse in his eyes. That had been the final confirmation she needed. The man she had loved was gone, replaced by someone cold, calculating, and capable of unspeakable horrors. But in that moment, as the gavel fell and the reality of his fate set in, Sherry felt a small spark of something she hadn't felt in months, a flicker of freedom. She had been trapped in a life of lies, her world revolving around Chris's manipulations and deceit. Now, for the first time in a long time, she was free. Free from the man who had torn her world apart. The process of healing would take years. Sherry knew that. There was no magic moment when everything would simply fall back into place. But she was determined to rebuild her life, not for Chris, not for the memories of a marriage that was long gone, but for herself, for her children, for their legacy, and for the woman she was becoming. Her life had been shattered, but it wasn't over. She had been through the worst kind of hell, and yet she had emerged stronger. The road ahead would be long and filled with pain, but Sherry knew she wasn't alone. Her friends, her family, they were there to help her pick up the pieces. In the quiet moments when the grief threatened to swallow her whole, Sherry held on to the memories of her children, their smiles, their laughter, the love they had shared. That was the only thing that remained untouched by the chaos Chris had brought into their lives. It was the one thing she could still hold on to, and it would carry her through the darkest days. As Sherry sat in the living room one evening, the weight of everything still heavy on her heart, she looked out the window, seeing the first hints of dawn breaking through the horizon. It was a new day, a day she would face on her own. But for the first time in months, she felt a small glimmer of hope. She was moving forward, one step at a time, and no matter what, she would continue to fight. For herself, for her children. The storm had passed, and though the scars would remain, Sherry knew that she had the strength to endure whatever came next. What do you think of Chris Coleman's actions and the shocking motives behind this tragic event? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this story as chilling as we did, make sure to hit that subscribe button for more true crime stories and updates. Stay tuned for more.